Hello, everyone, and welcome to the official Ubuntu YouTube channel. My name is Rhys Davis. I'm a product manager for Canonical, the company that publishes Ubuntu. And this.
Hello, I'm Martin Wimpress. I'm the engineering director for Ubuntu Desktop. So, what are we doing here today, Rhys?
So today we're going to talk the lovely users, the lovely viewers through setting up your Ubuntu Desktop on a Raspberry Pi. As of yesterday, the 22nd of October 2020, the latest Ubuntu release was released, Groovy Gorilla Ubuntu 2010, and with it comes full support for the Raspberry Pi. Today we're going to walk through setting that up and just what it means for users everywhere. We might whiz through some things a little bit, but you'll see links to tutorials and more information in the description below. So I think first things first, before we get started, is to talk a little bit about how this came to happen. Martin?
So yeah, I mean, there's lots of teams at Canonical, and this is a collaboration of several teams. So we have a kernel team, and a foundations team, and a desktop team, among others. And the three teams work together. So we have dedicated engineering in the kernel team who've been working on an optimized Raspberry Pi kernel. And then the foundations team, who are responsible for the foundations of every Ubuntu flavor and version, have put all of the underpinnings in to properly support the Raspberry Pi. And then the desktop team have done the work on top to actually provide an optimized desktop shell experience for the Raspberry Pi 4.
So let's get started. First things first, you're going to need a few things. You'll need a Raspberry Pi 4, no less. And because this is a full-fat Ubuntu desktop, you'll need either a 4GB or 8GB model. That's the one that I just showed you. You'll need a monitor, a power supply, like this one, a USB keyboard, a USB mouse, a microSD card, and HDMI to micro HDMI cable. And optionally, if you might want an Ethernet connection too, though that's not strictly necessary because we'll do some Wi-Fi config later. Once again, you'll find links to all of this in the tutorial in the links in the description.
So this is what I'm using today. Here's my Raspberry Pi 4 in a case. This is an 8GB model. I have a separate keyboard and mouse. They're wireless. This is available on the wireless network, and here is a collection of SD cards. Today I've got a collection of 32GB and 64GB SD cards to put the operating system on.
So now we have everything, we can start. First, let's prepare the SD card with the right Ubuntu desktop image. To do this, insert your SD card into your computer and get yourself the Raspberry Pi Imager tool. On Ubuntu, you can do this just by snap installing it, or on Windows or macOS, you can follow some more links in the description.
So I have already put the SD card in my computer, and I've got the RPi Imager up and running here. So I'm first of all going to choose my operating system. So from the list here, you'll see Ubuntu, and then here's Ubuntu 2010 Desktop for the Raspberry Pi. And then I'm going to choose the SD card, and that's already in there. So it's a 64GB SD card. Selected that, click right, and yes, I really want to do this. And now I need to put in my super secret password, and off it goes. So that's now writing out to the SD card.
So what we'll do here is we'll take a minute just to have a little bit of a chat. If you want to skip ahead, there should be some timestamps on the video itself. Otherwise, Martin, Mr. Director of Ubuntu Desktop, why did we make the Ubuntu Desktop for the Raspberry Pi 4 in the first place?
So one of the reasons we've created Ubuntu Desktop for the Raspberry Pi is it's something that the community have been interested in for years. We've seen lots of Ubuntu derivatives with different desktop shells running on the Raspberry Pi 2 and 3. But to deliver like a full workstation experience, it was kind of difficult with 512 megs of RAM or 1 gig of RAM. But today we've got plenty of CPU in the Raspberry Pi 4, we've got plenty of RAM with 4 and 8 gig models available, and an uprated GPU as well. So, you know, modern composited desktop shells run really nicely. And we can't ignore the sort of the tens of millions of Raspberry Pis that have been sold, which make the Raspberry Pi the de facto maker platform. And we really wanted to deliver a full Ubuntu desktop and developer experience for Raspberry Pi enthusiasts and inventors. And then, of course, you know, with the advent of the Raspberry Pi 4, we really have to start considering the Raspberry Pi Foundation as a PC vendor now. And that's another reason why we wanted to fully enable this device and bring our best operating system to it.
Okay, now that that's finished, we can run through the first boot setup. Martin?
Right, so I've got the Raspberry Pi here. The SD card is in, so we'll just turn that on. There's a switch on the back of this case. So that will power up the Pi, and then if we switch to the Pi itself, we should see, there we go, there's the usual boot screen for the Raspberry Pi. And in just a moment, the initial setup wizard will appear.
Okay, so now that's that, we can go ahead and get through the setup wizard. Some of you out there who have an Ubuntu pre-installed PC, you'll notice that this is the same setup and configuration wizard as we put on the PCs from the likes of Lenovo, Dell, and HP. We've taken that same configuration wizard and put it on the Raspberry Pi. So Martin, do you want to talk us through the process here?
Yeah, so the first thing I've done is pick my language, which is English. And then from there we'll move through the rest of the initial setup. And so it's asking me for my keyboard layout. I have a UK keyboard here, so I will just test my special characters. They're working correctly, so I move on again. And next I need to say where in the world I am, and London is close enough. This is so it configures your time zone. So I will put in my name. And I'm going to call this Ubuntu Pi, this computer, and it's derived my username for me. I'm going to put in a password. I wonder if I can type it twice the same. I can. And then I'm going to say I want it to ask me for my password each time I try to log in. And from that point onwards, it will now take you through the rest of the install. So behind the scenes, it's doing the initial configuration, setting up the keyboard and the locale and the time zone that you've just selected. So we'll just let that roll.
Great. Okay, and while that's cooking, I'll just say that it's a very similar process to the Raspberry Pi OS boot that you see with the Raspberry Pi Foundation's OS. You set the country, the language, if you set to London, you set your time zone, you have your password, and in this same process, you set up your Wi-Fi details and all of that kind of stuff as well. I just want to mention here that the Ubuntu Desktop for the Raspberry Pi is supported only for the Raspberry Pi 4 with 4 gigabytes or 8 gigabytes again, but all of the Pis from Raspberry Pi 2 onwards are supported by Ubuntu Server and Ubuntu Core, which we'll get into a little bit later, but I just wanted to state that here in case you're having issues with a different version of the Raspberry Pi. The Raspberry Pi 4 with 4 gigabytes and 8 gigabytes is the one that can handle the full fat Ubuntu that we're doing here.
So the slideshow has finished and we're just in the last phases of having the setup complete itself. So it's now doing some post-installation cleanup, and in a moment it will boot to the desktop. So the first setup has completed, so now I'm going to log into the desktop for the first time. So I choose my name, type in my super secret password, and the desktop will load. So just take a moment to initialize the first time you do this after the initial setup. It has to create your user profile. And here it is. So here's the desktop. And now we're going to be asked to go through the initial sort of desktop configuration. I'm not going to do all of these steps now, but here's a little look at what you can expect to see. So first of all, if you've got any online accounts, so your Ubuntu account or Google, Microsoft, or if you've got your own Nextcloud, we'll talk about that in just a moment, then you can authenticate with those now. I'm going to skip that step. And then it says, to help improve Ubuntu, would you send us some information about your hardware? I'm totally clicking yes on this one. Or you can see the full details of what's going to be sent, which is basically hardware information. So I'm going to send that off, count 1 for the good guys. I'm not going to turn on location services at the moment. I don't expect to take this outside of the house. And then it presents some software options, and we'll talk a little bit about software availability for ARM in just a moment. And that completes the initial configuration and setup of Ubuntu Desktop on the Raspberry Pi. So there's a couple of subtle changes between Ubuntu on the Raspberry Pi and Raspberry Pi OS, and we'll just go through a couple of those now. For enthusiasts, you'll want to know where you configure your firmware if you want to enable hats and other devices. So first of all, the terminal. There's a shortcut key, Control-Alt-T, or if you press the super key, you can start searching, and TER brings up terminal. So that's how you launch a terminal. And then you will find the firmware configuration in boot firmware, and then in this directory you will find the familiar config.txt file and cmd line.txt file. So those are the two files that you would use to configure any additional devices that you want to use. There's a few useful common configuration options commented out and described in those files for you. So what else is different, Reese?
So on a Raspberry Pi OS, you'll find that the likes of snap packages are able to be enabled, but in Ubuntu, snap packages, which are a universal software delivery system for Linux applications, are enabled by default and are a first-class citizen. This way, you're able to develop your applications for the likes of ARM.
Yeah, and that's, a powerful feature of having a full desktop environment running on the Raspberry Pi 4. We're seeing increasing adoption and use of ARM devices, not just by enthusiasts, but also device makers and vendors. And we're also seeing, ARM-powered laptops and other devices coming along. So this is a great way to actually work on the software that you've been creating and create ARM builds of those applications and get those published in the Snap Store. So hopefully now we can start to really build out that ecosystem of applications, and the more people we can encourage to desktop on the Raspberry Pi, then hopefully the more people will be motivated to bring their software to ARM to satisfy that user base.
All right, so now that that's sorted, we can go to the Ubuntu.com website and start talking through some of the things some of the extra things that we have. So the Ubuntu Desktop actually completes the Ubuntu family for the Raspberry Pi. We also have the classic server images and Ubuntu Core, and I'll let Martin do a bit of a click through and show you around.
Yeah, so here we've got Ubuntu Server. So just as you know it, regular Ubuntu Server has been available for a while now for the Raspberry Pi 2, 3 and 4. So you can download those images. In fact, you can put them on your SD card in the same way we showed you putting the desktop on an SD card earlier. So you can choose to put those on your devices as well. And then we have Ubuntu Core. This is our specially adapted, very trim, atomically updated, super secure version of Ubuntu, specifically for IoT devices, and this is an all snap version of Ubuntu. So if you want to make a hardened device for your Raspberry Pi projects, you can do that, and you can even publish them using the Ubuntu appliance portfolio. So Reese, you had a hand in the appliance portfolio. Can you just tell us a little bit about that?
Sure, certainly. So the Ubuntu Appliance portfolio is a collection or portfolio of images that we've worked with third-party projects and organizations, the likes of Nextcloud, Plex Media Server, AdGuard, and so on, to create these Ubuntu Core images that have their applications built in. So it's very much just a case of you go to the website, you go to the portfolio page, you click download, you flash the image like similar to what we've shown you today, but in a slightly different way because it's Ubuntu Core, and away you go. So you have a IoT device that has your Nextcloud instance or your AdGuard instance as a separate standalone device that works out of the box that you can just stick behind your TV, behind your sofa, and forget about. So now, Martin, let's head over to the Ubuntu discourse where we're going to do something new. So while we've been here talking, there's a specific thread over on the Ubuntu discourse about the Raspberry Pi desktop where you can leave specific comments or suggestions about what we've been doing here. Or even if you're interested, you can tell us what apps you'd like to see ported to ARM for a better experience on your Raspberry Pi PC. And we'll see if we can't talk to the upstream and see if we can get that done. Discourse is on the screen now, but there's a link in the description to the specific thread that we're talking about here.
Right, and if you're a USB boot enthusiast within the Raspberry Pi community, then you should find that USB boot is working on Ubuntu Desktop 2010. And we'd like you to try that out and share your experiences in the same topic that's linked below. And Reese, there's a couple of other projects you wanted to highlight as well, I think.
That's right. So while support for the Ubuntu Desktop is new, support for Ubuntu Server and Ubuntu Core has been around for a while. So there's a few tutorials and interesting little projects that you can get going with over there. There's the microKates tutorial, where we walk you through setting up a microKates cluster on 3 different Raspberry Pis and doing a bit of orchestration. And then there's the LXD Home Lab tutorial, where you build yourself an LXD Home Lab appliance and you can cluster them together and have a virtual machine provisioning Home Lab appliance ready to go.
And because this is the internet and people want to know what's new, we're just going to share a few things with you about what we're planning to do for the 2104 release on the Raspberry Pi. So we're going to be doing some work to finesse and finalize the GPIO implementation on the Raspberry Pi for Ubuntu Desktop. We're going to be continuing our collaboration with the Raspberry Pi Foundation on our kernel support, making sure we're tracking all the latest changes that they're bringing to the Raspberry Pi via the kernel. And hopefully, under the guidance of the Pi Foundation, we'll be making the transition to the full KMS driver. So this is a new driver that uses all of the traditional and contemporary APIs for enabling cameras and graphics and what have you on the Raspberry Pi stack. We think this should be achievable for the 2104 release, but we'll be monitoring that situation in collaboration with the Pi Foundation. And then we're going to be working on a bunch of hat modules. So this is something we'd like your feedback about. Again, in that discourse topic below, let us know what hats have you got? What's most popular? What do you want to see support for baked into the Ubuntu archive? And the internet's Daniel Van Vogt, who is an upstream GNOME shell contributor and has been working on a number of desktop optimizations over the years, is going to be working on optimizing the GNOME desktop shell specifically for the Raspberry Pi, above and beyond what we've already done this cycle. And Reese, I think you've got a few announcements you wanted to touch on as well.
That's right. I have three small announcements that I wanted to talk about here. So in the coming weeks, we're having a little bit of a collaboration with Pimeroni, one of the official Raspberry Pi vendors, and the Pi Hut, where we'll be working with them to send out some swag, some merchandise with orders of the Raspberry Pi. More information about that will be coming soon, either in a blog post or on Twitter somewhere, so stay tuned. And of course, we'd like to see you using these things. So if you set up your Raspberry Pi PC, whether you have it in your home or you're using it for something really, really interesting, we'd like you to show us. So if you could, talk to us about it in the discourse, or maybe tweet it at us at Ubuntu on Twitter, and we'd like to highlight some of the things that are going on out there. And if we really, really like it, we've got some spare Raspberry Pi themed Ubuntu release T-shirts, so you can have a gorilla with some cool glasses on your T-shirt. And finally, we are going to do a live Q&A in a few days. So now that we've done this and we have it released, we'd like you to, obviously, we hope you can give it a try and see what it's about. But we'll be back here in a few days to answer any questions you have. We'll have some of the engineers around to answer any technical questions you have. Or if you want to ask us about the future of what we're doing, that's fine too. We'll be back here in a few days. Martin?
So yeah, I'd like you to do all of those YouTubery things. So if you enjoyed this video, give it a thumbs up. If you got value from it, please subscribe. Subscribe specifically if you want to find out when that live Q&A is going to happen, because we'll be doing that here. And if you didn't like this video, give it 2 thumbs down. That also works. Thank you all for watching, and hopefully we'll see you in a few days after you've tried out Ubuntu Desktop 2010 on the Raspberry Pi 4, and you can share your feedback, thoughts, ideas and questions with us in our live Q&A, which is coming up next week. So we look forward to speaking to you all then.